The Nexus called it the Great Accordance, the day they brought peace to 1,000 warring worlds. But out here in the skeletal drift of the Kuiper Belt, we just called it the Leash. They didn't ban us from the stars, nothing so crude as that. They gave us a purpose, a function, a place in their vast, harmonious machine. Humanity became the janitors of the galaxy, the scrappers, the miners of radioactive hells that the more enlightened species of the Nexus wouldn't touch. They told us it was a role of honor, tending to the bones of the past so the future could be built clean. They smiled with their 1,000 different mouths as they said it, their collective consciousness humming with a placid superiority that was worse than any open contempt. We were vital. They cooed, yet we were contained, relegated to the graveyards and the gutters of space, forbidden from settling any world with a viable atmosphere. Our ships fitted with Nexus-mandated governors that capped our jump drives to the slowest, most inefficient routes. We weren't prisoners. We were just the help. And the help isn't supposed to have aspirations. My name is Kalen, and my aspiration was to not die, broke in the cockpit of the Vagrant, a rust bucket salvager that was more weld than original hull. My crew was just as broken. There was Jax, a gene-modded brute from the European labor camps whose quiet bulk hid a mind that could calculate gravitational slingshots on a cracked data pad. And there was Lena, a slicer from Mars whose fingers danced across code like it was a living thing. Her body a web of failing cybernetics she was constantly trying to keep one step ahead of. We were the children of the Leash, born into a galaxy that had a place for us, right at the bottom, and we'd learn to live in the cracks they left. Our hunting ground was the Boneyard, a silent field of wreckage from the pre-Accordance Wars, a place the Nexus deemed too chaotic and insignificant to police too closely. Here, ships from forgotten empires tumbled in a slow-motion ballet of death, their hulls scarred by weapons the Nexus had long since outlawed. We'd flit between them like carrion birds, stripping them of rare alloys, stable power cores, anything the orbital foundries on Titan would pay for without asking where it came from. The job that changed everything was a derelict cruiser, a ghost from the old Tenebran Concordate, a species of silicon-based life forms that had fought the Nexus to the last and been ascended for their trouble. The ship was a monster, a kilometer-long shard of obsidian metal bristling with dead cannons, its silhouette a jagged tear in the starlight. No one had touched it for a cycle. The rumor said it was haunted, that the psychic death scream of its crew was still echoing in the corridors. We weren't scared of ghosts. We were scared of defaulting on our fuel payments. We latched on, the Vagrant's magnetic clamps groaning in protest, and prepared to cut our way inside. The outer hull was thick, but Jax's plasma cutter chewed through it like rotted wood. When the breach was made, the air that hissed out wasn't dead. It was cold, sterile, and carried a faint, almost musical hum, like a tuning fork struck light years away. That was the first wrong thing. A ship dead for a century shouldn't have power, let alone atmosphere. We went on, our helmet lamps cutting pale cones through the oppressive dark. The inside of the Tenebran ship was alien, all sharp angles and crystalline structures that seemed to absorb the light. There were no bodies, no signs of a fight, just a fine layer of gray dust that covered everything. It was the dust that unnerved me. It wasn't inert. In the beams of our lights, it seemed to shift, to swirl in slow, deliberate patterns, as if disturbed by a breeze that wasn't there. Lena, plugged into the ship's local network through a port she jury-rigged, gave a sharp intake of breath. "Kay, you need to see this. The main reactor is offline, completely inert, but something else is powering the ship. A secondary source, isolated from the main grid. It's alive. We followed her directions, moving deeper into the ship's core, the humming growing stronger, resonating in my teeth, in my bones. It felt like the low-level psychic broadcast the Nexus used to maintain its placid harmony. But this was different. It was raw, discordant, filled with something that felt like grief. We found the source in the ship's astrogation chamber, a place that should have been a bridge. Instead of consoles and viewports, the room was a sphere, its walls covered in the same shifting, crystalline patterns. And in the center, suspended in a crackling energy field, was a black, multifaceted crystal the size of my fist. It was the source of the hum, the power, the wrongness. As we got closer, the dust on the floor swirled faster, rising up and coalescing around the crystal, forming hazy of its translucent shapes that looked unnervingly like the Tenebran themselves. Tall and slender with too many arms, ghosts made of dust and sorrow. It's a psionic amplifier, Lena whispered, her voice tight with awe and fear. But it's also a storage device, a soul catcher. My God, Kay, they didn't ascend. They were recorded. She worked furiously, her cybernetic fingers a blur, bypassing security protocols that were more like psychic traps than code. A wave of nausea washed over me as she broke through the last firewall. The hum in the room stopped. The dust ghosts collapsed. And then a voice filled our helmets, a voice of pure, undiluted thought, ancient and weary and burning with cold fire. It wasn't a sound. It was an idea forced directly into our minds. We are the last of the Tenebran, it said, the thought echoing with the memories of millions. We fought the Devourer, the lie that calls itself Nexus. They do not unite. They do not elevate. They consume. They feed on the spark, the soul, the very essence of a species, leaving behind placid husks and the memory of what was. This vessel, the unforgotten, is our final testament. This crystal, our choir, it holds our rage, our history, our warning. We could not defeat them, but we learned their weakness. As the voice spoke, images flooded my mind. I saw civilizations turning to dust, not through war, but through a creeping psychic apathy. I saw Nexus curators, beings of immense psionic power, gently cradling the minds of entire species and squeezing the life out of them, absorbing their thoughts, their art, their innovations, leaving behind a compliant, empty shell that would be seamlessly integrated into the great, harmonious machine. I saw the Tenebran fighting back, not with weapons, but with their own psychic abilities, scarring the Nexus's collective mind, a wound they could hide but never heal. And I saw their last act channeling their entire civilization's consciousness into this crystal, a psychic bomb waiting for a detonator. Their strength is their unity. The Tenebran choir continued, the thought growing weaker. They are one mind, one being, but that is also their flaw. A single, pure note of individuality, of defiance, of true chaos, can shatter their harmony. It is a concept they can no longer comprehend. They fear it. They fear you. They fear the human spark. The message ended, leaving a profound silence in its wake. The crystal pulsed once, a deep crimson light, and then the energy field around it died. It fell from its containment field, and Jax, moving on pure instinct, caught it before it hit the floor. He grunted, his massive hands dwarfing the object. "Feels does warm," he said, his voice rough. We knew, in that instant, that we were holding the single most dangerous object in the galaxy. Not a weapon of mass destruction, but something far more potent, the truth. It was a truth the Nexus had buried under a century of enforced peace and placid smiles. "We have to go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Now." Lena was already a step ahead, pulling her jacks from the console. "Too late," she breathed. The moment I broke the firewall, it sent a silent ping. Not through the network, through thought. "They know we're here. They know what we found." A new hum started, different from the Tenebran choir. This one was smooth, cloying, like honeyed poison. It wasn't coming from the ship, it was coming from everywhere at once. A psychic presence pressing in on us from the void itself. On the Vagrant, our long-range comms crackled to life. It was a Nexus frequency, one we weren't supposed to be able to even receive. A voice, impossibly calm and gentle, filled the cockpit. A voice that was both male and female, both young and old. It was the voice of 1,000 species speaking as one. "Scavenger vessel Vagrant." It purred. "You have trespassed. What you have found is a relic of a painful past. A memory best left undisturbed for the sake of universal harmony. Please surrender the artifact and submit yourselves for psychic realignment. There will be no pain. Psychic realignment. A mind wipe. They wouldn't kill us. They just scoop out our souls and turn us into smiling, compliant idiots." My blood ran cold. "Jax, get that thing back to the ship," I ordered. "Lena, get the engines hot. Scour every bit of your breach from that ship's logs. Leave nothing." We scrambled back through the darkened corridors, the psychic hum of the Nexus growing stronger, a pressure building behind my eyes. It wasn't just a broadcast, it was a probe, gently, insistently, trying to slip past my mental shields, looking for purchase. For a flicker of doubt, it could widen into a chasm. When we blasted away from the unforgotten, our ship shuddered. It wasn't the engines. A shimmering, translucent field had formed around us, a net woven of pure psychic energy. Our ship, governed and slow, had no chance of outrunning it. "The jump drive is locked out," Lena yelled, her hands flying over her console. "The governor is. It's being controlled externally." The Nexus voice returned, its tone shifting from placid invitation to disappointed sorrow. "The choice to resist only prolongs the dissonance. Harmony will be restored. Your consciousness will be welcomed into the whole." Then Jax, holding the Tenebran crystal, stumbled against the engineering console. The crystal flared, its crimson light washing over the cockpit. The Vagrant system screamed. Lights flickered. The engine coughed and then roared with a power I'd never heard from it before. "What the hell?" Lena shouted, staring at her readouts. "The Nexus governor is offline. The crystal. It just burned it out. It's interfacing with our systems. It's amplifying the reactor's output, bypassing all the safety protocols." The psychic net around us wavered, as if the raw, chaotic energy of the crystal was poison to it. I grabbed the controls, the ship bucking like a wild animal. "Can you plot a jump anywhere?" I yelled. "I can try." Lena's eyes were wide. "The drive is supercharged. I can't even calculate the destination coordinates. It's just pure energy. It'll tear us apart." The Nexus presence intensified, the gentle voice replaced by a rising tide of cold, focused will. The shimmering net began to reform. Stronger this time. It was now or never. "Do it," I screamed. Lena slammed her hand down on the jump initiator. The universe outside our viewport didn't stretch or blur. It shattered. The stars twisted into incandescent spirals. The boneyard vanished, and the Vagrant was hurled into an abyss of screaming, kaleidoscopic light, the defiant, sorrowful hum of the Tenebran choir echoing in our minds. We were fugitives. We were carrying a ghost, and we were heading absolutely nowhere. A single spark of chaos, fleeing the crushing, serene order of a galaxy that had just woken up to the fact that its janitors were no longer staying in their place. The exit from the jump was less an arrival and more a violent expulsion. The vagrant was vomited back into real space with a groan of tortured metal that vibrated through the deck plates and up my spine. For a long, silent moment, the only sound was the frantic hiss of a ruptured coolant line and the ragged sound of our own breathing. The kaleidoscopic chaos was gone, replaced by an absolute, profound blackness, a darkness deeper than the familiar star-dusted void of the Kuiper Belt. There were no nebulae here, no distant galactic arms, just a sparse scattering of unfamiliar, cold blue stars. We were adrift in the intergalactic void, a place navigational charts simply labeled, "Here be nothing." Status. I choked out, my hands trembling as I unstrapped myself from the pilot's chair. The ship felt wrong, the air thick with the smell of ozone and something else. Something organic and ancient, like deep earth. Lena was slumped over her console, a thin trickle of blood running from her nose. She wiped it away with the back of her glove, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Life support is holding, but barely. The main power conduit is fried, and in the port stabilizer is, well, it's not there anymore. We're bleeding atmosphere from a dozen microfractures in the hull. She paused, tapping at her screen. But the reactor, K, the reactor's output is stable at 300%. It's not even running hot. That crystal, it's not just powering us. It's integrated. It's rewriting the ship's energy matrix on a quantum level. I looked over at Jax. He was still on the deck where he'd been thrown, but he was sitting up, cradling the Tenebran crystal in his hands. The multifaceted object was no longer just a cold, black stone. It glowed with a soft, internal crimson light, pulsing in time with Jax's own slow heartbeat. He looked up at me, his normally stoic face etched with confusion. "I can hear them," he said, his voice a low rumble, not like before, not a message. It's like a hum, 1,000 songs all being sung at once. They're scared, they're angry, but they're grateful. He touched the crystal to a dead console, and the screen flickered to life, displaying a complex, flowing script I'd never seen before. Tenebran. It was repairing us. Or, more accurately, it was remaking us in its own image. The Vagrant was no longer just our ship. It was a lifeboat for an entire civilization, a mechanical body for a chorus of ghosts. The weight of that realization was crushing. We weren't just carrying a secret, we were a living vessel for it. And out in the crushing emptiness, the Nexus was hunting. I couldn't feel their psychic presence directly anymore, but the absence of it was just as terrifying. It was the silence of a predator that has lost the scent but is still methodically circling, casting its net wider and wider. We were a single discordant note in a symphony of forced harmony, and the conductor would stop at nothing to silence us. Spent 3 cycles patching the hull, rerouting power, and trying to understand what we had become. Lena worked in a feverish trance, reverse engineering the interface between the crystal and the ship. She found that the Tenebran choir wasn't just providing power, it was actively shielding us. It had created a low-level psionic field around the Vagrant, a cloak of static that, she theorized, would make us invisible to the Nexus's passive psychic sensors. We were hidden, for now. Jax, meanwhile, had become the crystal's keeper. He rarely spoke, but he seemed to be in constant, silent communion with the artifact. He'd sit for hours just holding it, his brow furrowed in concentration, He told me the Tenebron were teaching him, showing him things. He described the inner workings of the Nexus, not as a government or an empire, but as a biological entity, a Gestalt consciousness that had grown so large it had forgotten it was ever made of individual parts. It didn't conquer, it absorbed, digested, and repurposed. To the Nexus. We weren't rebels, we were an undigested bit of gristle. On the fourth cycle, just as our water recycler began to fail, a signal cut through the silence. It was weak, heavily encrypted, and using a pre-accordance protocol that was ancient even by scrapper standards. It wasn't a distress call, it was a marker, a lighthouse in the endless dark. "I've got a location," Lena announced, her voice tight. A single rogue planet orbiting a brown dwarf, about 2 days' burn from here. The signal is coming from a station in high orbit, K. It's a free human signature. Free human. The term was a myth, a boogeyman the Nexus used to scare its more compliant members, a ghost story about those who had supposedly escaped the Accordance and fled into the void. To us, it had just been a story. Now, it was our only hope. We jumped, this time with a semblance of control. The crystals seemed to understand our intent, and the transition was jarring but not catastrophic. We emerged into a dim, red-lit system. Before us hung a planet cloaked in perpetual twilight, and above it, a sight that made the boneyard look like a pristine shipyard. It was a station, but it was alive, a chaotic, sprawling mass of hundreds of ships, asteroids, and habitat modules all fused together. A city built from the cast-off refuse of the galaxy. Lights glittered from 1,000 different ports, and the space around it was thick with small, darting vessels that moved with a predatory grace. This was Haven, the source of the signal, and it looked less like a sanctuary and more like a pirate's nest. We were hailed before we were even within 1,000 kilometers. The voice was human, female, and sharp as broken glass. "Unidentified vessel. State your name and business. You are broadcasting a psionic signature I haven't seen before. Cut your engines and prepare to be boarded, or I'll gut you and sell your reactor for scrap." There was no point in lying. "This is the scavenger vessel Vagrant," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "We are independent. We're seeking repairs and sanctuary. We mean no harm." The woman on the comm laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Nobody out here means any harm, darling. They just end up causing it. A boarding party is on its way. Behave yourselves." A ship detached itself from the station's chaotic mass and accelerated towards us. It was a brutal-looking gunship, its hull a patchwork of different alloys, a dozen weapon emplacements tracking our every move. Resistance was suicide. When they docked and forced our airlock, 5 figures came aboard. They wore piecemeal armor and carried pulse rifles that looked far too well maintained for simple scavengers. 4 of them were human, their faces hard and wary. The 5th was a Xylan, a tall, insectoid being with 4 arms and iridescent eyes, a species that was supposed to have been one of the first to be ascended by the Nexus. Their leader, a woman with a shaved head, a cybernetic eye that glowed a faint blue, and a scar that ran from her temple to her chin, stepped forward. "I'm Mara," she said, her voice the same one from the comm, "and this is my station. Now, you're going to tell me what a little rust bucket like you is doing all the way out here in the dark. And you're going to tell me what that thing is." Her cybernetic eye was fixed on Jax, and on the glowing crystal in his hands. The air grew thick with tension. Behind Mara, the Xylan clicked its mandibles, a low, threatening sound. I made a choice. We were too damaged to run, too weak to fight. Our only currency was the truth, or at least a version of it. We ran afoul of the Nexus. I began. We found something in a derelict, something they wanted. This. I nodded towards Jax. It got us away. That's all we know. Mara's organic eye narrowed. She took a step closer to Jax, who stood his ground, his hand tightening around the crystal. What is it, a relic? I said. From a species called the Tenebran. At that name, the Xylan froze. It took a hesitant step forward, its iridescent eyes fixed on the crystal. It emitted a series of soft, chittering clicks. Mara glanced at it. Xyle recognizes the name. The storytellers speak of them. The star singers who fought the Great Silence. So, the stories had survived out here. The Nexus hadn't managed to erase every memory. The Xylan, whose name was apparently Xyle, reached out one of its 4 delicate, claw-tipped hands. It wasn't an aggressive gesture. It was one of reverence. Jax, guided by an instinct that wasn't entirely his own, held the crystal out. As Xyle's claw touched the crystal surface, a wave of palpable energy washed through the vagrant. It wasn't violent. It was pure information, pure emotion, images, sounds, and feelings flooded my mind. The sorrow of the Tenebran, their defiance, the cold hunger of the Nexus, the terror of the Xylan people as their own song was silenced, and they were force-fed the Nexus's placid harmony. Xyle had been a child then, smuggled away by a handful of survivors before their world fell silent. Everyone on the bridge staggered, gripping their heads. Mara grunted, her cybernetic eye flickering wildly as it tried to process the psychic data burst. She stared at the crystal, then at me, her hard expression broken by a flicker of something I couldn't identify. Awe, fear, hope. You didn't just find a relic, she said, her voice a low, shaken whisper. You found a weapon. You found a ghost that still knows how to scream. She straightened up, her professional mask of command slamming back into place, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. We were no longer just refugees. We were an asset and a liability. Get your ship docked, she ordered, her tone all business again. You have guest status for now, but understand this. Vagrant, you didn't find sanctuary. You just brought your war to my doorstep. And if the Nexus comes knocking, I will feed you to them myself to keep my people safe. She turned to leave, her boarding party falling in behind her. As she reached the airlock, she paused and looked back at me, her gaze intense. Welcome to Haven, she said, a grim smile touching her lips. Try not to get us all killed. The airlock hissed shut, leaving us in a silence that felt heavier than before. We had found other humans, other outcasts, but we were far from safe. We had traded the sterile, psychic cage of the Nexus for a physical one, a den of survivors who would see us as either a tool or a threat. And as I looked at the Tenebran crystal, pulsing softly in Jax's hands, I knew Mara was wrong about one thing. We hadn't brought the war to her. We had just fired the starting gun. Docking the Vagrant in Haven was like trying to thread a needle in an earthquake. The station, a sprawling metal reef christened the Clasp by its inhabitants, was a constant hive of activity. Ships of every shape and size, most of them looking as battered and modified as our own, swarmed around it like pilot fish. We were guided into a cramped, dark docking bay where the air tasted of stale coolant, ozone, and the faint, spicy aroma of alien cooking. Mara was waiting for us, flanked by Xyle and 2 heavily armed guards. Her cybernetic eye whirred softly, scanning every dent and weld on our hull. "She's a mess," was her only comment on our ship. "My techs will look her over. They'll see what can be salvaged. Your crew gets quarters in the spoke. Don't wander. Don't start trouble. And that thing," she nodded at Jax, who was holding the Tenebrand crystal protectively, "stays with you. I don't want it in my armory, and I sure as hell don't want it out of my sight." The spoke was a long, curved corridor that formed one of the main arteries of the clasp, a labyrinth of welded-together ship hulls and habitat modules. It was a river of life, a chaotic cross-section of the galaxy the Nexus had tried to erase. Humans in worn vac suits haggled with four-armed traders, a hulking, cybernetically enhanced species I didn't recognize lumbered past, carrying heavy cargo containers. In a darkened alcove, a small reptilian being was meticulously cleaning a pulse rifle, its unblinking eyes tracking every passerby. This was freedom, and it was loud, messy, and smelled vaguely of desperation. For 10 cycles, we lived in a state of suspended animation. We were guests, which meant we were prisoners with slightly better food. Mara's techs swarmed the vagrant, their reports confirming what Lena already knew: the ship was a paradox, a junk heap held together by alien ghost technology that was rewriting its fundamental physics. Meanwhile, my crew was changing. Lena, given access to Haven's impressive, albeit chaotic, data network, worked relentlessly. She was no longer just trying to understand the Tenebrand crystal. She was trying to figure out how to weaponize its truth. The Nexus maintains its harmony through a constant, galaxy-wide psionic broadcast. She explained to me one cycle, her eyes glowing with the reflected light of a dozen data screens. It's like a carrier wave of pure placidity. It doesn't just calm people, it actively suppresses dissent, individuality, strong emotion. But the Tenebrand choir, it's the opposite. It's a carrier wave of pure, unfiltered memory and identity. If we could broadcast it, even for a moment, on the same frequency the Nexus uses, it wouldn't be a weapon. It would be an antidote. It would wake people up. The idea was terrifying and beautiful. Not to kill the Nexus, but to unravel it. To give the galaxy its memory back. But to do that, she continued, her expression turning grim, I need to build a focused psionic amplifier. A bigger, cruder version of the containment field that was on the Tenebrand ship. And that requires a resonance chamber forged from stabilized exotic matter. Tech that hasn't been seen since before the Accordance. Tech that the clasp almost certainly doesn't have. Jax had changed the most. The quiet, hulking man was becoming something else. He spent most of his time in our small quarters, in a meditative trance with the crystal. The Tenebrand script now flowed from it at his command, projecting onto the walls, telling the epic, tragic story of their civilization. He was no longer just its keeper. He was its translator, its priest. They're not just a memory, Kay. He told me, his voice softer, more measured than I'd ever heard it. They are a consciousness, and they're learning. They're learning about us, about humanity, our chaos, our stubbornness, our ability to hold a grudge. They like it. They say we burn bright. He had also learned to tap into the crystal's power in small ways. He could sense the emotions of people nearby, a low-level telepathy that made him profoundly uncomfortable in the crowded spoke. He could create small psychic static fields, enough to make a security camera flicker or a person momentarily lose their train of thought. He was becoming a psionic, a wielder of the very power the Nexus had monopolized. I felt like the only one who hadn't changed, a relic of our old life, a captain with a broken ship and a borrowed cause. My job was to navigate the treacherous currents of Haven's politics, which meant dealing with Mara. I found her in her command center in Tsiter, a repurposed freighter bridge that offered a panoramic view of the clasp. She listened to Lena's proposal without interruption, her cybernetic eye glowing faintly. "A resonance chamber," she said when I finished, the words tasting like ash. "You might as well ask for a dragon's egg. There's only one I know of, and it's not for sale." She gestured to the viewport. A ship was docked at the far end of the clasp, a sleek, heavily armed courier vessel that looked out of place amongst the station's junkers. "That's the Stiletto. Belongs to a man named Silas. He runs the Outer Ring habitats, controls most of the mining claims. He and I have a disagreement about how Haven should be run. He thinks harboring refugees like you is a suicide note. He'd rather make a deal with the Nexus, secure a pardon, go back to being a compliant cog in the machine. So, the infection of fear had a foothold, even here. Silas salvaged that resonance chamber from a wreck years ago." Mara continued. "He thinks it's just a power converter. He doesn't know what it really is. I need leverage against him. His operations are clean. Too clean. I know he's hiding his real ledgers, proof of his illegal mining and weapon sales. They're on a data bank aboard a derelict freighter in his territory, the Iron Maw. He uses it as a dead drop. It's guarded, but he'd never expect an assault. You're scrappers, you're tries. You know how to move through a dead ship without being seen. Get me that data bank, and I'll get you your chamber. A favor for a favor." The mission was a familiar kind of poison, a simple theft, a return to the life I thought we'd left behind. But the stakes were infinitely higher. The Iron Maw was a hulking wreck of a cargo hauler, lodged in a dense asteroid field that served as Silas's private fence. We took a small, stealth-modded skiff from Mara's private fleet, slipping through the debris field like a ghost. Lena stayed on the skiff, ready to slice into the derelict systems. Jax and I would go in. The presence of the crystal, which Jax now wore in a specially made harness on his chest, cloaked our skiff's energy signature in a layer of psychic static. As we cut through the hull of the Iron Maw, I felt a grim sense of déjà vu, another dead ship, another secret hidden in the dark. But this time, the ship wasn't empty. "I feel them," Jax whispered as we moved through the silent cargo bay, his voice tight. "4 of them, up ahead, near the auxiliary bridge where the databank is. They're nervous." He was our early warning system. We moved through the corridors like shadows, Jax guiding us with a subtle pressure on my arm, a mental nudge that pointed me away from a guard's patrol route or a hidden pressure plate. We reached the auxiliary bridge, a cramped room filled with smashed consoles. The databank was a reinforced black box bolted to the far wall. 2 guards stood before it, their rifles held at ease. We had the element of surprise. We could take them down, hard and fast. But Jax held up a hand. He closed his eyes, and the Tenebrand crystal on his chest pulsed with a soft, crimson light. A flicker of movement appeared in the corridor behind the guards. A shadow detached itself from the wall, coalescing into the tall, slender shape of a Tenebran warrior, its form hazy and made of pure psychic dust. One of the guards turned, his eyes widening in superstitious terror. "What the hell was that?" he stammered. His partner laughed nervously, just the old ship groaning. "Relax." But he was spooked. The distraction was all we needed. I moved in, my stun baton humming, and took the first guard down with a precise strike to the back of his neck. The second one spun around, raising his rifle, but Jax was already there, his massive form moving with a speed that defied his bulk. He didn't strike the man. He simply placed a hand on his forehead. The guard's eyes went wide, then rolled back in his head as he collapsed. caught in a psychic feedback loop of his own fear. We grabbed the databank and were halfway back to the airlock when all hell broke loose. Alarms blared, and red emergency lights bathed the corridor in a bloody glow. They found the guards. Lena's voice crackled in our ears. Silas has 2 more teams converging on your position. We ran. A plasma bolt seared the wall next to my head. Silas's men were behind us, shouting. We rounded a corner and came face to face with another team, trapping us. We were outgunned, outnumbered. Jack's eye yelled. He nodded, planting his feet. He held the crystal with both hands and pushed. It wasn't a physical force. It was a wave of pure, concentrated thought. The collective grief and rage of 1 billion Tenebrine souls focused into a single point. It was the psychic equivalent of a flashbang grenade. Silas's men cried out, dropping their weapons, clutching their heads as a century of alien sorrow slammed into their minds. It wouldn't kill them, but it gave us the opening we needed. We made it back to the skiff, blasting away from the iron maw just as Silas's courier, the stiletto, arrived in a blaze of engine fire. Back on the clasp, we delivered the databank to a grimly satisfied Mara. She kept her word. Within the hour, a team of her enforcers had stormed the stiletto, armed with the evidence from the databank and a warrant for Silas's arrest. The resonance chamber was ours. But as Lena began her work, hooking the priceless artifact into the modified systems of the Vagrant, Mara showed me what was really on the databank. It wasn't just ledgers of illegal mining. Buried under layers of encryption was a communications log, a series of short, coded bursts between Silas and an untraceable source. He wasn't just afraid of the Nexus, Mara said, her voice dangerously quiet as she pointed to the decrypted text on her screen. He was negotiating with them. He was going to sell us out, all of us. He was going to give them haven in exchange for his own safety. The message on the screen was a week old. It was a reply from the Nexus. And it was only 2 words. Harmony incoming. The enemy wasn't circling anymore. They knew where we were. And they were on their way. The 2 words harmony incoming hung in the silent command center like a death sentence. The quiet hum of the clasp's life support systems suddenly sounded like the last breaths of a dying man. For the first time since I'd met her, Mara looked shaken, her cybernetic eye twitching as it reran the decryption a dozen times, as if hoping for a different outcome. Silas's betrayal was a festering wound, but this confirmation of the consequences was the killing blow. Haven was no longer a secret. It was a target. How long, I asked, the word scraping my throat. Mara's gaze shifted from the screen to the star chart dominating the main wall, a 3-dimensional map of their tiny, forgotten system. Their jump signatures are different, slower, more deliberate than a military fleet. They don't use brute force to tear a hole in space-time. They persuade it to open. My best guess, 5 cycles. Maybe 6 if we're lucky. 5 days. 120 hours to prepare a disorganized flotilla of scavengers, miners, and refugees for a war against a god. The news spread through the clasp, not like a wildfire, but like a frost. The chaotic energy of the station muted into a tense, fearful silence. Old arguments were forgotten, replaced by huddled conversations in dark corners. Some started hoarding supplies. Others, their faces blank with a despair I recognized from my own early days under the leash, simply sat and stared into the void. But Mara was a force of nature. She didn't allow the fear to fester. She called a station-wide assembly, her image flickering onto every public screen, from the grimy cantinas to the hydroponic bays. For generations, we have survived in the dark. Her voice rang out, stripped of its usual cynicism. forged into something hard and inspiring. We survived the accordance. We survived starvation. We survived each other. We did it by being the galaxy's forgotten children, the grit in the gears of the great machine. Now, the machine has noticed us. The Nexus is coming, not to punish us, but to erase us, to fold us into their silent, placid song. They offer a peace that is indistinguishable from death. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the assembled crowds as if she could see every one of them. I don't know about you, she finished, her voice dropping to a dangerous growl, but I've never been one for choirs. It was the spark the station needed. The fear didn't vanish, but it transmuted into a jagged, angry defiance. Haven began to prepare for war. Welders worked around the clock, sealing bulkheads and mounting scavenged cannons onto asteroids. Miners repurposed their seismic charges into makeshift naval mines. The chaos of the clasp organized itself into a single, sharp point of resistance. Our war, yes, however, was being fought in the humming guts of the Vagrant, which had been moved to the most heavily shielded engineering bay in the station. Lena was a woman possessed. She hadn't slept in 3 cycles, her body fueled by stimulants and a terrifyingly intense focus. Her failing cybernetics were pushed to their limits, wires trailing from her ports to the massive, jury-rigged device that now filled the cargo bay. The resonance chamber sat at its heart, a cage of conduits and power relays all focused on the Tenebran crystal, which pulsed with a steady, ominous crimson light. It's alive, Lena told me, her voice raspy, gesturing at the contraption. The moment I integrated the chamber, the crystal's psionic output stabilized. It's not just a battery anymore. It's a broadcast antenna. The Tenebran choir is tuning itself. It's learning the frequency of the Nexus. She looked at me, her eyes bloodshot but burning with a fierce light. I can make this work, Kay, but it's going to take everything this station has. When I throw the switch, this amplifier is going to draw on every reactor in the clasp. For the 30 seconds it takes to broadcast, Haven will be dark and cold. While Lena built the weapon, Jax learned how to aim it. He was rarely lucid in the way I understood it anymore. He'd spend entire cycles in a deep trance, the crystal resting on his chest, his mind adrift in a sea of alien memory. He was charting the psychic landscape, learning to distinguish the individual threads of the Tenebran consciousness, the warrior poets, the builders, the sorrowful historians. He was no longer just listening to their song. He was learning to conduct it. It can't just be a scream of rage, he murmured to me during a rare moment of clarity, his eyes focused on something far away. That's just noise. The Nexus feeds on chaos and smooth it into silence. To break the harmony, you need a counter melody, a story. We have to broadcast their truth, their name, unforgotten. That's the key. A declaration of existence. That's the one thing the Nexus cannot absorb. On the 4th cycle, the Nexus arrived. It wasn't a fleet of warships. It was something far more insidious. The first sign was a feeling. A subtle wave of calm washed over the clasp. The frantic energy of the preparations eased. Welders slowed their pace, their movements becoming less urgent. The tense arguments in the mess halls softened into quiet murmurs. It was the broadcast Lena had described, the psychic carrier wave of placidity, seeping into our minds like a slow-acting sedative. Mara's enforcers started reporting incidents of guards simply walking away from their posts, a faint, beatific smile on their faces. Then came the whispers. They weren't in our ears, they were behind our eyes. Personalized temptations I delivered with the gentle touch of a lover. I saw my old life, the simple, grinding existence of a scrapper, but it was painted in hues of peace and contentment. No debts, no danger, just the quiet satisfaction of a role well played. You are tired of fighting. Kalen, a voice that was and wasn't my own, murmured in my mind. There is harmony in purpose. Lay down your burden. I saw Lena offered the schematics for flawless, self-repairing cybernetics, a life free from the constant pain and decay of her own body. I saw Mara standing on the bridge of a secure, prosperous haven, a respected and peaceful administrator within the Nexus. The attack was a psychic siege, designed to make us lower our own weapons, to make us open the gates willingly. Jax was our only defense. He roused himself from his deep communion, his face a mask of strain. He stood in the center of our quarters, and with a deep, shuddering breath, he pushed back. The crystal on his chest flared, and a different kind of song filled our minds, the low, sorrowful, but defiant hum of the Tenebran. It was a shield in a bubble of raw, unfiltered identity that kept the Nexus's cloying peace at bay, at least for those closest to him. But he couldn't protect the whole station. Then, the source of the broadcast appeared. A single ship dropped out of a fold in space, hanging in the void beyond our minefield. It was not a warship. It was a work of art, a long crystalline vessel that seemed to be carved from a single piece of mother of pearl. It shimmered with an internal, golden light, and its form seemed to shift and flow, more organic than mechanical. A curator vessel. Mara breathed from her command center, her voice tight with a primal fear. A pacifier class. It doesn't have weapons. It doesn't need them. That ship is the source of the broadcast. It's a psychic cannon. The pacifier began to pulse, and the wave of harmony intensified 100-fold. I felt it slam into Jax's shield. He cried out, staggering, a trickle of blood erupting from his nose. His defense was cracking. On the station's internal comms, I could hear screams giving way to placid, unnerving silence. We were losing. Lena. Now I yelled into my comm. "It's not ready," she screamed back, the sounds of arcing electricity crackling behind her words. The final energy matrix isn't calibrated. It could overload every system on this station and blow us all to hell. We're already in hell, I roared. Light it up on the bridge of the Vagrant. I saw her slam a heavy red lever down. The lights on the clasp didn't just dim, they died. The entire station was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. Its power funneled into a single point. For a heart-stopping second, there was only silence. Then, the Vagrant screamed, a beam of pure, crimson thought, visible even to the naked eye as a shimmering distortion in space, erupted from our ship. It wasn't a laser, it was an idea, a memory, a name, fired like a bullet. It struck the crystalline hull of the pacifier, and the Nexus ship did not explode. It shattered. The golden light within it flickered and died, and the beautiful flowing hull cracked and broke apart like a dropped porcelain doll, its pieces tumbling silently into the void. Across the clasp, a collective gasp went up as thousands of minds were suddenly, brutally freed from the psychic pressure. The harmony was gone. We had done it. We had won. But as the cheers began to echo through the corridors, Jax collapsed to his knees, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The crystal on his chest was glowing so brightly it was painful to look at. Lena's voice came over the comm, shaking with a new kind of terror. K, the broadcast. It didn't stop when the pacifier was destroyed. The feedback loop it's still going. The amplifier is locked on. That shot, it wasn't just a shot. It was a flare. A psychic flare visible across the entire galaxy. My blood ran cold as I looked out the viewport, past the wreckage of the curator ship, into the deep black. Lena was right. We had survived. We had fought off the wolf at the door. But in doing so, we had just lit a fire on a mountaintop, screaming our defiance to the heavens. And now, the rest of the pack knew exactly where we were. The cheers that had erupted throughout the clasp died in the throat, replaced by a cold, spreading dread that was far worse than the placid harmony of the Nexus. We hadn't just poked the beast, we had rung a dinner bell and painted a target on our own backs. The wreckage of the pacifier was a testament to our victory, but the psychic echo of our weapon was a map leading straight to our door. Mara's command center was silent. The faces of her lieutenants were grim masks. The brief taste of triumph already turned to ash in their mouths. Down in the engineering bay, the scene was one of quiet panic. Lena was desperately trying to shut down the amplifier, but it was like trying to cap a volcano. The Tenebran crystal was no longer a tool. It was an open wound in reality, bleeding a raw, unfiltered stream of psionic energy into the void. And at the center of it all lay Jax. He was alive, but only just. His body was a conduit for a power it was never meant to contain. His skin was laced with faint, crimson patterns like Lichtenberg figures, and his slow, shallow breaths were matched by the pulsing of the crystal on his chest. He was the anchor, and the storm was tearing him apart. We had one cycle before the silence came. That's how Zeal described it. The Xylan storyteller, whose people had seen this before, spoke of the Nexus's final response not as a fleet, but as the Great Silence. It wasn't an attack, it was an absorption. The full, undivided attention of the Gestalt consciousness turning towards a single point of dissonance. It would be a wave of pure psychic will, so vast and so absolute it wouldn't just pacify minds, it would unwrite reality, smoothing over the messy or chaotic wrinkle of Haven until it was nothing but serene, empty space. We felt its approach before we saw it. The stars began to dim, not as if obscured by a cloud, but as if their light was being siphoned away, drained of its energy and its meaning. The whispers returned, no longer tempting, but full of an immense, weary gravity. The voice of a billion assimilated souls sighing in unison. Cease. It was a command that resonated in our very atoms, a psychic entropy that urged us to simply stop being. It was Jax who woke us from our despair. His eyes snapped open, and they were not his own. They burned with the light of a billion dying stars, the collective consciousness of the Tenebran looking out through a human face. He rose, not with the pained stiffness of an injured man but with an impossible of fluid grace. The crimson patterns on his skin glowed softly. When he spoke, it was with a voice that was both his and 1,000 others, a chorus of defiance. It is not an ending, they said, looking not at me, but through me, at the soul of our species. It is a transference. The choir cannot win, but its song can be preserved. You were chosen. Your chaos. Your refusal to break. You are the vessel. He walked to the viewport, placing a hand on the cold transparasteel, and for a moment, the dimming stars outside seemed to brighten in response. The vagrant can jump, not between between everything. The amplifier was not built to be a weapon. It was built to be a key, to unlock the final door. Lena understood first, her face a mask of horrified comprehension. A trans-universal gateway. A brain shift. It's theoretical. It's suicide. The energy required would consume a sun. It will consume a soul, Jax Tenebrand corrected gently. One that has already been forfeit. It will be the final note of our song, a crescendo that will tear a hole for you to slip through. The echo of our passing will scar this place, a permanent wound in the Nexus's mind, a dead zone where their harmony can never take root. They will not be able to follow. The choice was laid bare before us. A single ship, an ark, could escape, carrying the seed of true, chaotic life to another reality, another beginning. But Haven, and everyone on it, would be the price. The sacrifice. I looked at Mara. All the cynicism, all the hard edges she had built around herself to survive, had been stripped away. In her eyes, I saw not a pirate queen, but a leader facing the impossible. She looked around her command center, at the faces of the people who had followed her into the dark, and a sad, proud smile touched her lips. "We were always living on borrowed time," she said, her voice clear and steady over the station comm. "We never asked for a peaceful end. We only ever asked for a meaningful one." She turned to me, her organic eye meeting mine. "Go, Kalen. Take your crew. Take Zyle. Take anyone who will fit. Be our memory. Make sure the bastards know we didn't go quietly. Make our story worth the telling." The last hours were a blur of frantic, heartbreaking activity. The Vagrant was loaded with supplies, data cores containing Haven's entire history, and a handful of chosen survivors. The rest of Haven's fleet, a motley collection of gunships and armed freighters, formed a defensive perimeter, their engines flaring in a last, glorious act of defiance. They weren't preparing to fight. They were preparing to die loud. I stood at the airlock of the Vagrant as the final refugees came aboard. I saw faces streaked with tears, but no one was screaming. There was a profound, terrible sense of purpose. They were the anchor, and we were the kite, and they were preparing to cut the line. My last sight of Mara was her standing on her bridge, raising a flask in a silent toast. She wasn't a queen on a throne. She was a captain going down with her ship. Then the great silence arrived. The void outside didn't just go black. It became a wall of absolute nothing. The few remaining stars vanished. It was a presence that consumed light, sound, and thought. Haven's fleet opened fire, their plasma bolts and missiles vanishing into the nothingness without a flash. Their defiant shouts on the comms swallowed by an endless void. At the heart of the Vagrant, Jax stood before the amplifier, no longer a man but a figure of pure, crimson energy. He turned to me, and for a fleeting instant, the old Jax, my friend, looked out from the storm. He smiled. "Tell them, we climbed," he whispered. Then he placed his hands on the Tenebrand crystal. The universe outside our viewport dissolved. The great silence was torn asunder by a silent, screaming wave of pure, crimson light. It was the unleashed, unfiltered consciousness of the Tenebrand, a billion souls singing their last song of defiance, of memory, of life. It was a beautiful, agonizing symphony that ripped a hole not in space, but in the fabric of existence itself. I saw Haven's fleet charge into that wave, their silhouettes stark against the impossible light before they were consumed by it. Their end not an erasure, but a final, defiant chord in the Tenebrand song. The Vagrant plunged into the wound. The jump was not a journey, it was a rebirth. We were stripped down to our component atoms and reassembled on the other side. When the shuddering stopped, I looked out the viewport. The stars were different. They were brighter, younger, arranged in constellations no human had ever seen. The cloying presence of the Nexus was gone, replaced by a clean, beautiful, shrieking emptiness. Lena's console chirped, a single, hopeful note in the silence. Life support was stable. The reactor, now free of the crystal's ghost, was humming with its own meager power. We were adrift, but we were alive, and we were free. We are the last of Haven. We are the echo of the Tenebran. We carry the memory of those who chose a meaningful death over a meaningless peace. We don't know where we are or what waits for us in this new, unwritten galaxy. But we are humanity. We are the spark of chaos that would not be extinguished. We don't just survive, we climb. And out here, among these new stars, there is a whole new universe to ascend.